So we're marking 50 years since the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we want to take a look at what has changed in the 50 years since that time. Have we progressed as a nation? What work needs to be done? I'm joined by a very special panel today to talk about the legacy of Dr. King and its importance to our country. Joining me today are Dr. Antipas Harris, president of the Center for Urban Renewal in Norfolk, Virginia. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me here, Jamie.
Also joining us is Dr. Estrelda Alexander, president of William Seymour College in Lanham, Maryland. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And Republican strategist Shermichael Singleton. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's get right into it. 50 years, very, very important milestone. Dr. Antipas, I'll start with you. What has changed in the past 50 years? Has there any progress been made?
Yes, well, of course, we've had a lot of progress. In fact, I'm from the Deep South. I'm from Georgia, so I have direct experience of the change that has been made over the last 50 years, so I appreciate the legacy of Dr. King. I do think that we have a long way to go, but I think we can't deny that we've come a long way.
Yeah, and when you say we have a long way to go, what does that look like?
Well, as we have an increasingly majority-minority country, I think there's been a bubbling of a lot of the sentiments that led to Jim Crow that seem to be percolating again, and we need to have a new way of thinking about what the future of our country should look like with the new diversity that is coming to our country.
And Shermichael, coming from a younger generation, how would you view the legacy of Dr. King, particularly nowadays?
I mean, I think from a policy perspective, as someone who's worked for several presidential candidates and tons of other politicians in general, I mean, I guess I would probably say that his arguments for equality, legislatively speaking, is something that we should perhaps focus on a little more. I think when you look at the discrepancies between education and people of color, the discrepancies between income, the income gap, even the housing gap, which we're beginning to see that widens even more as it becomes more expensive to live in certain places, for example, like D.C., where a lot of African Americans are being pushed out. So when you think about all of those things that Dr. King advocated for and spoke about throughout his life, I think we should look at some of those points and revisit them as we attempt to pass policy legislation to tackle them.
And Dr. Alexander, you're nodding your head in agreement.
Well, I think a lot of the change that has happened since Dr. King has been surface change, and some things certainly have changed. But I think they've changed more for middle and upper class blacks, such as myself, who have taken advantage or been given the advantage of education. But for the average, everyday person of color, I think the gaps have widened in some ways. But more importantly for me, as a theologian, what has widened is the deep-seated division, emotional, psychological, spiritual division between the races, such that there's this undercurrent of hatred in some cases, distrust, that gets played out in a lot of ways. And what Dr. King had hoped for was that the races would be able to, like he said, judge each other on the content of their heart, not the color of their skin, and much of the judgments that we make today are still based on skin color.
Yeah. Dr. Harris, why do you think that is?
Well, I think that there's deeply woven into the fabric of American society an original sin. I think that the spirit of Jim Crow continues in the country, and the laws that were passed under civil rights movement were certainly for the benefit of those who were seeking to get those laws passed, the integration of schools and things like that. But when you have a pervasive spirit of Jim Crow that is never dealt with, laws won't change that. Attitudes need to change, and the way that people think need to change.
Well, Shermichael, let me direct the next question to you.
Sure.
In what ways do you think progress has been made? How have we been successful as a country, if we've been successful?
I think now that people are more emboldened to talk about things that they perhaps weren't willing to talk about in the past. And that isn't to necessarily say that there aren't people who hold sentiments that the public by and large would not necessarily agree with, but that is to say that I think you're seeing a new generation of people of various ethnicities that are saying we recognize these challenges. We had hoped that we have progressed and surpassed the issues of our parents and of our grandparents, but since we have not, we're willing to tackle them. And you see that with gun violence. You see that with racism, with individuals speaking up about immigrants. Now, I personally believe that, we have to have immigration policy. I think that's very important. But I do think that you can address those things from a position of compassion. And I think you're seeing a lot of that with individuals my age and even a little older. And I think that is in part because of the experiences of our parents and grandparents. And so that's the progress that I think we have made. And I think you'll continue to see that progress as we move forward.
Dr. Alexander.
That sounds good on paper, but I think part of the problem is that we don't realize how flawed human nature is. And yeah, you should be able to look at situations and say, this is just wrong. But you talked about self-reflection. One of for me, this society, since King represented for me a person who was self-giving. What I see in the current culture is a level of narcissism, self-interest. I want to protect my own. And so you do need to engage the other so that you can understand that your situation may be bad, but there are people who are worse off than you.
Hold on one second. I want to take a quick pause here because I'm enjoying this spirited conversation because I think it's good. Listen, it's good to have conversation. It's good to have different views, and it's good for all of us to be able to express those views to each other and to learn something from each other. But first, we want to take a quick little break because we had an opportunity to sit down with Roland Martin, Gianno Caldwell, and Raynard Jackson to discuss living the dream. 50 years after the assassination of Dr. King, where do we find our nation? Take a look.
I think back regularly as to what progress we've made since that time and what direction our country is going in. And I'm absolutely excited to know that we've come so far, and I'm so thankful for that. But I do also realize that there's a lot more work to be done.
What he represented was a time and place where young people said, we have to change. Everybody forgets when Montgomery starts, this guy's only 25 years old. When he gets killed, he's 39. And so you're talking about individuals who are putting it on the line.
Dr. King was saying, we don't want special treatment because we were black and we were former slaves. He said, all we want you to do is enforce the Constitution. That's all we wanted to do, because the Constitution already took care of everything we were being denied back in the Civil Rights Movement. The Constitution already addressed. We had the right to vote. We had the right to live wherever we wanted to live. We had the right to go into restaurants and be able to eat at the counter, and had the right to go into the front door of a hotel. That was already in the Constitution. It was not being enforced. So Martin Luther King comes along and says, would you please enforce the Constitution? We don't want special privileges. Just enforce what the framers have already codified in the Constitution. That's what he was promoting. That's why his movement not only was an American movement, but it took off all around the world.
Yeah, we made some progress. I mean, the reality is, when I walked into this building, I didn't walk into a colored bathroom. I didn't drink out of a colored water fountain. We made progress in that I can live in Northern Virginia, and I can live in a neighborhood where there are whites and there are others who are in the same neighborhood. So I'm not limited to or segregated to one particular place. But the reality is, we still are living with the vestiges of that. It is still in our system. It is still embedded in our system.
Because I have a dream, that speech, which obviously rang true today, it was much more than that. So let's learn about who the individual was and why he was that particular individual.
And welcome back. I'm happy to be joined with Dr. Antipas Harris, Dr. Estrelda Alexander, and Shermichael Singleton. And we're going to continue the discussion on the legacy of Dr. King and what it means for our country.
I think that even in the black community, if we would do more, to your point, of reinvestment into our community,
Yes.
Our schools, right?
Our
In
institutions,
my
yes.
view, we need more investment in places like William Seymour College and other HBCUs. We need more investment into economic development within our community, microfinancing, entrepreneurship training, leadership development. All of that, I think that we need to collectively give ourselves to in organizations like mine that are seeking to try to do that. Sometimes we find it more difficult in the black community where there's wealth to make our case that we need to do this to help our community. So that's part of sort of the alienation that you were talking about from the middle class and the lower class. I think that African Americans, we have to be cognizant and careful that we don't disconnect ourselves from the communities that nurtured us because we have moved up economically. And I think that is an issue that I think that King would not be too happy about.
No, I agree. I mean, I think to that point, when you look at the Jewish community, for an example, or even the Hispanic community, when they do accumulate wealth, how they make sure that there is a direct attachment, a direct line back to their communities. I mean, when you think about their spending habits, the dollar will stay in those communities weeks before it actually goes into another community.
And so basically what you're pointing to is the fact that as a community, African Americans have to come together. We have to come together to be able to achieve things that we feel will benefit our communities, that we feel will benefit our economic standing, that will benefit education. And that was one thing Dr. King talked about.
Garnish that prophetic voice that King had.
Absolutely.
Yes, that's what he was. We went to the same school. He graduated his doctorate from Boston University, and so did I. He went back to Georgia.
You wanted to throw that in.
He's from Georgia, and so am I. So he went back. He went back to Georgia.
He also attended Morehouse.
Yes, he did. But he went back.
Throw that out there.
But he took his intellectual gravitas, his prophetic voice, and he took it back to his community to help lift up his community. We have a charge to keep, if you will.
We could do a 6-hour broadcast on this. And like I said, this is an important conversation to have, particularly as African Americans. I think, again, we all have different backgrounds and experiences and different perspectives. And I think to be able to, in this particular forum, have this conversation, I'm grateful that each one of you were able to come today. Because this is something that I think the country, the world needs to see, that while we may disagree on how things get done, we all have one goal. We all have one goal. And
what is that one goal?
Well, the one goal is to make sure that as a community, as a country, that we're providing people with the opportunities necessary for prosperity. With that said, I'd like to finish up our conversation.
And defining prosperity is human flourishing, not just wealth.
Correct.
But if humans flourish, wealth will happen for everybody.
This is a great group.
Well, I mean, not if a system is set up that you can only become wealthy at the expense of other people.
Else.
So, I mean, the American dream
and we've talked about that earlier.
That way.
Yeah, certainly. But I don't want to get away from what our topic of the day is.
Well, that's part of the topic.
It is part of the topic.
I mean, King died with the poor man's campaign, poor people's campaign.
Absolutely.
Right, and we need to continue that.
So I would like to ask each one of you, as we look back on the 50 years since the death of Dr. King, what is one thing you've taken away from his life, from what he's taught, from what he spoke about how he lived, that has impacted you in your own personal life? I'll start with you.
For me, the day that we fail to speak about the things that matter is the day that our life ends. So for me, it's important. The prophetic voice that King had is particularly important for me as a theologian and also a community leader and an educator. I think that the voice, the platform, the opportunity that I have is not just for me, but for me to speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves and to give voice to the problems that other people are experiencing. And so for me, that's the legacy I continue to keep.
Dr. Alexander.
For me, what I admire most about King is that he was willing to die for something. And I tell people all the time, if you have nothing you're willing to die for, you really don't deserve to live. And he knew, he wasn't surprised by his death. He knew that he was going to at some point be taken out of here. And he was willing to go ahead with what he thought was important anyway. And the death may not always be physical, but there's got to be something so important to you that you're willing to give your life for it. And that's how we make change. It can't just be, it'll happen one day. We have to have a passion that we're willing to die for.
Mr. Singleton.
I would say compassion. I think now as the country becomes more diverse, when you think about Dr. King, he had compassion for all different types of people. And I'm reminded of a speech that Ronald Reagan gave, I guess back in the 80s. I can't remember the direct quote, but essentially he said, you know, you can't go to many other countries if you're an immigrant, but in the United States, we will welcome you. We will welcome you because we recognize that it is our diversity that makes us strong as a nation. But if that is to reign true, you have to have compassion about all different types of folks, and I think that's something that's currently missing from the national discourse right now.
All right, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander, Dr. Harris.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you all so much for joining us, and I'm sure this
Absolutely.
conversation will continue off camera. Something tells me it will. And thank you so much for joining us. You know, one thing that I personally want to say is, as we look back on 50 years since the assassination of Dr. King, there are lessons that each and every American can take away from his life, from what he preached, what he taught, how he lived his life. And it's my hope that as we continue as a country, that we could one day live out his American dream, which is to be able to be in relationship with one another without having to rely on race to separate us or as some sort of barrier between our communities. I'm Jamie Jackson, the political correspondent with the Daily Signal. Thanks so much for joining me. Appreciate it.